Good evening. Welcome to the UFO and Paranormal Research Society of Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I am the director for UPARS LA. It is October 17, 2017, and we have a very, very special presentation for you tonight. We brought to you a leading authority on the Roswell incident. Don Schmitt is the former co-director of the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, where he served as the director of special investigations for 10 years. That takes a lot of heart. Don graduated from MATC with a degree in commercial art and graduated cum laude from Concordia University with a degree in liberal arts. He's the author of hundreds of articles about UFOs, as well as the co-author of 5 best-selling books, which he has there on the back table for you to view and possibly purchase down the road. The books include UFO Crash at Roswell, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, Witness to Roswell, Witness to Roswell Revised Edition, and Inside the Real Area 51, The Secret History of Wright-Patterson. Don has led and organized 4 official archaeological digs at the Roswell crash field in 1989, 2002, 2006, and 2013. He has the highest rated show up to that time on the History and Sci-Fi channels called The Roswell Crash: Startling New Evidence. He's an internationally known lecturer, including the Patel Institute. His interview list includes Oprah, Peter Jennings, CBS 48 Hours, Paul Harvey, Larry King, The Montel Williams Show, Art Bell, George Norrie Coast to Coast, NPR, and it goes on and on, Disney Channel, Travel Channel, Omni Magazine. Don feels that by far his greatest achievement was the Golden Globe Best Picture nomination for the motion picture Roswell. That was based on the first book he co-authored with Dr. Kevin Randall. I've said a lot. Don is a gentleman. He's a family man, and he comes all the way from Wisconsin. And so I want you to put your hands together and give him a warm welcome. Don Schmitt.
Last time I was here, I mentioned to Steve, even coming down, that LA is starting to feel, at least for me, the way it did when I would make my first visits. And even in the late 80s and through the early 90s, and the way the whole Roswell movie even came about, I'll just give you a little background before we even get started. I had learned that there was a producer in LA that had a sighting, he and his son and daughter, a dreary late afternoon, overlooking as far as the Pasadena Valley through that area in North LA. And I get a phone call from actor Roy Thinnis. How many remember the TV series The Invaders? Well, I've known Roy for now over 30 years. And he's asking me, what should I do? And I told him, the character he played in the series was David Vincent. And so I told him, well, go play David Vincent. Go and investigate it for me. And the interesting thing, we all have seen the classic science fiction movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still, the first one. What's wonderful about that film is that my scientific director, the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek, he was the technical consultant, the advisor to Spielberg's Close Encounter of the Third Kind. That famous 7-second cameo of Hynek stepping out at Devil's Tower, and he's clutching his classic prop, his pipe. But even the term Close Encounter of the Third Kind was one of his classifications that he had devised in his book, The UFO Experience. Well, anyway, Dr. Hynek, Allen had just finished working on the set. He was back at his home in Evanston, Illinois, on Ridge Avenue, just down from the Evanston Hospital. So I'm at the house, and I say to him, so now, Allen, I suppose Close Encounter is now your best UFO movie. And he went, no, it's still The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now, the reason I mention that movie is, who directed The Day the Earth Stood Still? Robert Wise. West Side Story, Sound of Music. He was a line editor with Orson Welles as far as Citizen Kane. He did the first Star Trek movie. And for me to have met him and for he to attend the premiere of our Roswell movie at the Directors Guild and shaking our hand, I am so proud of you boys, I am so proud of you boys. And it didn't hit me till later. And how it was because of Robert Wise that our movie Roswell was indirectly made, because what had happened was before Roy Thinnis from the Invaders TV series had called to inform me of this producer's sighting, the person who tipped the witnesses off to actor Roy Thinnis was none other than Robert Wise. The producer was talking with him, and he said, well, you know who you should talk with is actor Roy Thinnis. Roy would call me, and then it would lead to my being invited to come and investigate and spend time with the producer, and then eventually he would option the movie rights, and we did the Roswell movie. How many have seen Roswell? I would recommend, again, we were nominated Best Picture Made for TV Movie, Golden Globe Awards. And you want to talk about a stellar cast. Everyone from Kyle MacLachlan, Martin Sheen, Dwight Yoakam, Kim Grice, Xander Berkeley, Charles Martin Smith, Doug Worth, Peter McNichol, Bob Gooten, I mean, all the way down for a made-for-TV movie. Now, when we were nominated Golden Globe, we were invited to sit at the table with the cast and crew. Obviously, we were the writers. It was based on our book. And for the rest of my life, I will regret the fact that we were so committed, we were so devoted to our investigation. We were working in the field at that time, and we didn't attend the Golden Globe Awards. As though it's going to happen again in my lifetime. Maybe. I mean, we have 2 other books that are optioned for pictures, but again, what are the chances? And so I can honestly say we were devoted, weren't we? We were racing with The Undertaker even then, because the Roswell witnesses, as they now are almost all passed on. As we've always said, we're racing with The Undertaker, and we're truly on the 1-yard line with about 30 seconds left in the game. And hence the title of the talk tonight, because so often as we would approach these potential witnesses, these old retired Army officers, or the old cowboys, the ranchers who were initially involved, and then even their wives. But more times than not, we had to go through the children. We had to be invited. We had to be introduced. More times than not, the children often ran interference. They were very protective, understandably. But nonetheless, when we would gain that confidence, it also was with the children. And then we would start to listen to their testimonies, their strange tales of intimidation and fear, harassment. The fact that they lived with a father, or they lived with a spouse who it was as though they were confined within a bubble, that the government still maintained such control over them after all those years that they could never penetrate, they could never even get to the heart of what their fathers, their husbands had experienced back in 1947. And then you would listen to the pain and the emotion as they would describe that I only had half a father. The government had the other half. And then to ask them the obvious question, over a weather balloon? And so the children start to create even a greater impact, because As a younger person, I couldn't empathize with the witnesses, but certainly I could with the families. Anyone who's had a parent, anyone who's been married to someone, for example, who truly possessed top secret information, you know what I'm talking about. Because, again, you only have half of them. Uncle Sam owns the other half. Now, in the guise of national security, we certainly understand, we appreciate that we have secret keepers. We need secret keepers. Covert activity warrants a response of covert activity. The Soviets had spies, we had spies. There were all types of secret tests that went on, and so we're no less appreciative of the fact that, thank God, people can keep secrets. One of the greatest secrets of all time certainly was the Manhattan Project, the development of the atomic bomb. But those people have all now been cleared. They're all now talking. For the ones that then lived beyond to the point that they were given a clearance, a release from their security oaths, we know now most of those secrets. But Roswell, after all this time, when I think of how many of our principal witnesses that took it with them, who died with the full account of what transpired, and the finality of realizing that whatever they possessed is gone forever. So now we are left with nothing more than their children. And to hear how many of them received deathbed confessions, how they would sit, and we're going to go through a number of these, with their fathers, with their husbands, in those last days, those last hours. And this is what they talked about. I don't think it's part of this program, but I just want to, because it's something a little bit more recent, but yet it involves one of the older deathbed testimonies. And it involved an MP, a military security officer, who worked in K Squadron, the kitchen staff, back at Roswell in 1947. But given that Roswell was the first atomic bomb squadron in the world at that time, in fact, the Enola Gay boxcar, the two B-29s that ended World War II, were hangared at Roswell after the war. Point being that every man and woman on that base had a top security clearance because they also had the atomic bomb. And I don't care if you swept a broom, you had a top security clearance on that base. And Melvin Brown was assigned guard duty out at the impact site. He was posted behind one of the ambulance trucks. He was told to keep his eyes forward. And the first chance he got, he lifted up the tarp in back of the truck, and there he saw two bodies. And they weren't one of us. So needless to say, he never said another word about it to his family. Now just imagine, any one of us, just try to place yourself in this situation. Your husband, your father, has only been given a number of days. He's still lucid. He has his wits about him. He knows what's happening. He knows that his time is running out. And he sits there with his wife, and Brown would take her by the hand and say, "Sweetheart, I want you to know that I've always been faithful to you." And then you go on and tell her all about Roswell. Now, I haven't just heard this. I went back and I rewatched the video interview of his widow and his two daughters, and because originally I was only interested in the Roswell portion of their testimony. I finally decided I was going to go back and watch the whole thing. And I'm watching his wife, Adele, tear up. She's wiping tears away, how he had said all his goodbyes. He takes me by the hand. He wanted her to know that he had been true to her all of their married years. And then to equate it on the same level, he tells her about what really happened at Roswell. It wasn't any damn weather balloon. I saw the bodies. Now that may not mean anything to a skeptic. Which demonstrates just how cold-hearted many of them are, because they can't look at the emotion of the very people. We're talking about fellow human beings. That's why I asked you to place yourselves in that same situation. And I think any one of us would then conclude that it would demonstrate that after all those years, what happened back in 1947 was still that important to him, that he equated it to his being faithful to her. And again, I can't imagine a weather balloon rising to that level. So, in setting the theme, I'm asking you also to place yourselves, continuing for the next, for the extent of the presentation, in the shoes of these children, these family members, these spouses, and to hear and experience what they have, not just years thereafter, but decades thereafter, even into the recent years. And then ask yourselves, what could possibly have happened back in 1947 of such importance that after all this time, the children are forced to lead lives that, as one witness told us before passing, it's the first thing I think of every morning when I get up, and it's the last thing I think about when I go to bed. And again, I would hardly doubt a weather balloon would rise to that occasion. So, how many here this evening need a cursory, a quick, fact check regarding Roswell? Okay. What was the most sensitive region of probably the world back in 1947, post-World War II? New Mexico. I'm still amazed how often when I speak on college campuses and I'll ask even the faculty present, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? And how many of them so proud to say Japan. And how they then slink down in their chairs when you say, no, New Mexico. June of 1945, Trinity site. And then beyond that, the ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos post-World War II. I had mentioned the 509th Atomic Bomb Squadron headquartered at the Roswell Army Airfield in Roswell. You had all the captured German V-2 rockets being tested at White Sands Proving Ground. So it was the hotbed of military activity. And according to Project Blue Book, there were more UFO sightings in New Mexico at that time than anywhere else in the country. So it was as though someone else was very interested in our military potential at that time. Now, just imagine, we would arrive at an inhabited planet. Wouldn't that be one of the first things we would check out? Do these guys, have a bigger gun than we have? Are they going to be a threat to us in any way? Before we land on the White House front lawn, and what would be the first, we talk about the day the earth stood still, what would be the first reaction we'd have as far as an actual arrival confrontation? We'd shoot first. It's human nature. It hardly suggests that we've matured as much as we'd like to believe, but we still live in this, the world of fear and paranoia, and whenever we feel threatened, we shoot. But with all of this activity, all these sightings, late evening, July 2nd, there was a loud crash, explosion. It was something between the thunderclaps that evening. A rancher by the name of W.W. MacBrazel would ride out checking as far as the rainfall on a ranch 75 miles northwest of Roswell, and he discovers a huge debris field. Material he's never seen before, nothing that he can identify. Covers an area of almost 3/4 of a mile long. And it involves material that's paper thin, practically weightless. You could hold it in your hands and it was like nothing was even there. But you couldn't cut it, you couldn't burn it, you couldn't scratch it. Later, the military would talk about that they would even take a 16-pound sledgehammer and they would pound into it and the hammer would just bounce right off. There were I-beam structures of the same material with hieroglyphic-like symbology that ran the lengths of these sections. And there were silken strands of like microfilament fishing line that you would hold a light up to one end and then light would then emit out the opposing end. Well, we were talking fiber optics back in 1947. And yet fiber optics weren't developed until around 1970. And then the material we refer to as our Holy Grail. The same type of nearly indestructible paper-thin, metal-like material, but this you could wad up, you could crease, you could fold, and you'd release your grip or you'd place it down and it would smooth right out, flow like water without the slightest sign of damage. We don't even have such material today because this is right before your eyes. Now, nobody's able to recognize any of this wreckage, and then he would report it to the sheriff's office in Roswell, who in turn would contact the 509th, the most elite, the most highly secured military facility in the world at that time. And the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, upon witnessing this wreckage, that the rancher brought in a couple boxes, he would assign not a couple of enlisted men, a couple of grunts to go humor the rancher, go check it out, but he sends his two head of intelligence, Major Jesse Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cabot, who was counterintelligence, in the event it's something foreign, which also speaks volumes, demonstrating that they can't recognize this stuff. So by the next morning, and they're out at the site after following the rancher and spending the night and gathering up as much material as they could, filling up 2 vehicles. They returned back to the base. And the early morning, Tuesday, July 8th, the Roswell Army Airfield puts out a press release. Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. One of the most famous press releases, banner headlines of all time. Imagine that today. No. But yet, it's a matter of historic fact that a press release went out by the first atomic bomb squadron in the world, that they were 100% convinced they had captured a flying saucer, based on the wreckage that they had examined. As Colonel Blanchard, the base commander, would say, at first we thought it had to be Soviet because we had never seen anything like it before. But once you held it in your hands, you realized, heaven help us if it is. What became of this press release? Well, 5 hours later, they shifted all the attention away from Roswell, and they didn't have a press conference there, but they had a press conference going up the chain of command at the Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth, Texas, where Colonel Blanchard's boss, General Roger Ramey, the head of the 8th Air Force, had a press conference. And they displayed a common weather balloon with a radar reflector kite on the floor. I'm sure most of you have seen the pictures. And Major Marcel is ordered to pose in 2 of the pictures. And you can just look at the expression on his face, which speaks volumes. Because as not only Marcel, but all the other principal witnesses involved. They knew what the truth was. So I always like to say, meanwhile, back at the ranch, there are 50 to 60 troops on their hands and knees, shoulder to shoulder, for the next 3 days, gathering up every piece of wreckage. And there's another site where there are a couple bodies discovered. And as one of the witnesses, one of the personnel from the base, when we were doing CBS 48 Hours, and with senior news correspondent Phil Jones asking, well, how do you know they weren't human? To which he responded, they sure weren't from Texas. And he made his point quite effectively. So, in a nutshell, that's basically what happened. That first they announced they had captured a flying saucer, and then they spun it into a weather balloon reflector kite. And it wouldn't be until 30 years later. And Major Marcel, who again was the fall guy, he was the patsy. He was the one who was ordered with the phony wreckage, the balloon wreckage. And he was told, just be a good soldier, Jess. In 5 years, 10 years, it'll all come out. So he waits 5 years, 10, 15, 20, 30 years later, and he's been diagnosed with terminal emphysema. And he realizes it's not going to come out. So he steps forward. And I'll quote then Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Marcel. Quote, being familiar with all materials, both foreign and domestic, this was nothing made on this earth, end quote. All right, but you didn't read that banner headline in any newspaper back in 1978. Nobody touched it except one publication, which was the National Enquirer. So you see how even 30 years later, it's as though they have anticipated us, that they've made sure that it would become such a taboo topic that not only does the scientific community, academia, but also the media does not touch it, does not treat it seriously. One of the reasons that when we've had these archaeological digs, and Steve had mentioned we've had 4, we're now up to our 5th archaeological dig at the debris field, crash site. And would anybody recommend any national laboratory here in the United States that should we ever find anything that we should turn it over and hope that they would give us legitimate analysis of such a sample? I'd love to see it. Because it's interesting that since 1947, all the national laboratories are government contracted. So in other words, they get anything funny, especially if it's even of a foreign design, they want to know about it. And in this case, it's truly foreign. So it's one of the reasons we've often had to go out of the country. So there too, it's made it very difficult for us to even rely on science, rely on experts, professions that can help us substantiate what we're dealing with. And as I just described, I don't have to, especially for those of you who are involved in this subject matter, I'm sure then you've also had your own personal experiences dealing with the national media. The fact that I've yet to see them really get this subject correct. When we, just as a quick example, when we were getting ready for the 50th anniversary of Roswell, and I was being interviewed by Time magazine, and it was a senior science editor. And I meant to demonstrate the level of expertise and background of the personnel at Roswell. Not only being World War II veterans, but that many of them also were part of the Manhattan Project just a few years earlier. Now again, mind you, this is the senior science editor at Time magazine in 1997. And there was a pause, and she came back, "Oh, that happened in New York, didn't it?" She had no idea what the Manhattan Project was. Now, I don't expect every novice, every lay person, everyone here tonight even to know themselves either, but she's the senior science editor at Time magazine. So is it any wonder that they keep getting it wrong? When they're assigned to look into Roswell or UFOs in general, and they have all of a month to put it all together, is it any wonder they take the easy way out? Investigative journalism truly has become a lost art. And Roswell has demonstrated that time and time again, because it is so all-encompassing. Any other UFO experience involves a sighting, maybe a photograph, maybe a video, maybe a landing, maybe a trace. But with Roswell, when you talk about an actual recovery, you're talking about the physical evidence, you're talking about the physical remains, you're talking about all the documentation, you're talking about all the photographs, all the film, everything involved, aside from the witnesses. And it's the reason that I'll stand before anyone and state it's the granddaddy of all UFO cases. Because we don't have to wait for a return. All we have to do is point to Washington and say, "Tell us the truth. Disclose. We deserve to know." So it's on our level in that regard. How many happened to catch Bill Clinton last time he was on Jimmy Kimmel? And what did they talk about? And Roswell. And Roswell. And Kimmel now has made it a practice that whether it's President Obama or Hillary Clinton or even most recently George W. Bush, what does he ask them about? And they all respond the same way. "I can't tell you." Or in Clinton's case on Kimmel, "I had 8 years in the Oval Office and I couldn't get the truth about this." Ben Hansen, who I'm sure many of you know of from the sci-fi series Fact or Faked, but prior to that he was an FBI analyst who specialized in voice analysis and body language analysis. And if you go into YouTube, he does a wonderful analysis of Bill Clinton on Jimmy Kimmel. And you watch, and I was with him, we were working on a Smithsonian documentary at the time. And so we were going back and forth and stop action, and so I assisted him with a lot of it. But you watch the president when he's talking and having fun and his head is rolling back and his arms are, waving back and forth. He's having a great time. When he's talking about Roswell, he's clenching his fingers into the armrest and he's clenching his jaw and he's twisting his neck. And as Hansen concluded, there's only two possibilities by that portrayal of the way he discussed Roswell that evening on Jimmy Kimmel. He either knows the truth and he can't talk about it, and we know Bill Clinton, he has a hard time not talking about, what he knows, or, as he said, "I had 8 years and I blew it. I didn't get the truth, and now I'll never get it. But that's demonstrating there is a truth. There is something that even at the level of the office of the President of the United States, that they too are deprived. They too, are forced to honor or live in fear of intimidation and paranoia of something that totally surpasses the office of the President. If I mentioned the name Dana Perino on Fox News, she keeps talking about Roswell, to the point that some of her colleagues in one of the news shows finally said, now Dana, you were the press secretary to George W. Bush. Didn't you ever ask him? And she very coyly said, well, in fact, one day I did walk into the Oval Office. And I asked him, I said, Mr. President, what can you tell me about Roswell? Now you notice all they have to say is Roswell, and everybody knows what you're talking about. And it's not Roswell, Georgia. And she would then say that President Bush looked at her. He smiled and then he winked. And then he turned, sat behind the desk and didn't say a word. Again, it's open to interpretation, but nonetheless, it's like, I know something and don't ask me about it. I know something and I can't talk about it. So that's all I can do, just a wink. Don't ask. And that's the way she took it. The point being that for all of us sitting here this evening, for all of us who have an open mind regarding UFOs, we're in very good company. No matter what your politics, because we are talking about presidents, Clinton, Carter, the late Senator Barry Goldwater, the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, the former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, a wink of the eye from George W. Bush, that type of thing. All the other presidents, on Jimmy Kimmel being asked about Roswell and UFOs. And I mentioned this to Steve on the way over. What do any of the skeptics have on them that they know the truth and the president doesn't? What sources do any skeptics have that they know more than Bill Clinton does about Roswell? Because if we talk about the ultimate arrogance, how many have ever heard of the Rashomon effect? It's from a Japanese movie. It's a Japanese murder trial. And it was presented in that fashion that, and just think about this because it applies to all of us. You have your opinion on a given event, and I have my opinion. And then there's what really happened. The difference between myself and the skeptics, I'm still trying to determine what really happened. The skeptic is saying, I don't need to know what really happened because I tell you what happened, and you better believe it. Big difference. Big difference. And that's the wonderful thing about the fluid investigation of Roswell. We're still trying to determine what even the president either was never told or unable to tell. So again, we're in good company. This was after the balloon explanation came out. From the banner headline, they had captured flying saucer. The very next day, the Roswell Daily Record, Wednesday, July 9th, I mentioned General Ramey with the balloon press conference, and General Ramey empties Roswell saucer. So ladies and gentlemen, those simpletons, those idiots over in Roswell who are in charge of the atomic bomb, they couldn't recognize off-the-shelf neoprene rubber, reflective foil, wooden sticks, masking tape, and string. But here I am to tell you that, ladies and gentlemen, that's all it was. And what still boggles my mind is that the skeptics still go, yes, but that's what I say it was, so you better believe it. Again, the Rashomon effect. Opinions and what really happened. That's Floyd and Loretta Proctor. When Brazel first found the wreckage, there was a 7-year-old boy with him by the name of Timothy D. Proctor, their youngest son at that time. Now, as Brazel returned him back to his parents, and he had some of the wreckage with him, and they observed how he tried to whittle on it with his pocket knife, and they saw that it had no effect, nothing, it wouldn't scratch or mar it in any way. And young D. Proctor would gather up some of his friends, and they rode back out to the debris field. So it started the souvenir hunt. They started to gather up pieces of the wreckage. Well, another few days before Brazel would still go into town. This was Loretta's brother, Robert Porter, who was a sergeant with the 715th Bomb Group. And he would be involved later with the loading of some of the real wreckage into the bomb bay of a B-29, going to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. My partner, Tom Carey, took this picture. The Corona High School. Now just imagine a high school class of 1950 of 8 people, 8 students. And you see, if you can read Proctor at the bottom. Okay? For all the efforts, for all the times that we tried to talk to Timothy D. Proctor, he would always slip out the back door. We'd hear his pickup truck go flying down, the gravel trail from the ranch house. On one occasion, his mother, Loretta, would say, Dee's been gone all day, and all of a sudden, who would stumble out in a bathrobe and rubbing his eyes like, Mom, what's for breakfast? But Dee. And he would see us and turn right around and go, I should have slept longer. And, and once again, totally avoid us, ignore us. So my partner, Tom, jokes about that when he took the picture, that even for the camera, he still was trying to get away from us. Now, the reason that D. Proctor is so important is that, as I mentioned, that his friends at that time, the other ranch hands and young cowboys, the talk was that back at that time, as fast as you could walk, you'd be put on a horse. That you were already working on these ranches. So here was 7-year-old, Timothy D. Proctor. So it was no effort on their part to jump on the back of the horse and, ride back over to this ranch where all this funny material was located. Well, Brazel would be out because typically after a bad storm, they would check for down livestock. It's high desert. When the lightning strikes, it actually hits the ground. We've observed that ourselves on a number of occasions. And so you can imagine the cattle and the sheep standing above ground in the high desert. So typically with the ranch, and Brazel was the foreman, not the ranch owner. He was the foreman, the supervisor. They would watch for the circling hawks. The birds suggesting downed animal, downed cow or sheep. And he had a number of young boys with him to help in such a search. And they would find about 2.5 miles from the debris field, east-southeast, atop this bluff, not the remains of any cow or sheep, but 2 bodies. 2 bodies that Brazel immediately, concluded were part of that debris field. Somehow, this had to be the crew. 2 of the beings from the actual object that had exploded just 2.5 miles to the north. Dee was with him. Timothy D. Proctor would arrive home, and his mother said that he looked as though he had seen a ghost. He wouldn't eat for days, wouldn't talk about anything. And this would then transcend to the point that 50, 60 years later, he still wouldn't talk about it. Now, Dee was one of the young boys, the young witnesses that we thought we still had time. And Dee died of a heart attack about 10 years ago, at the age of about 60. Nothing nefarious, nothing suspicious about. He became a roaring alcoholic. He was just intensely obese, and he couldn't keep a job. He couldn't stay in any relationship. It was as though his whole life had been ruined over something. And the only thing that his own family ever suggested of such a traumatic nature that took place was atop this bluff, atop this site. Now, the closest that Timothy D., would come to finally acknowledging something. His mother, Loretta, had a blood clot in her carotid artery. It became life-threatening. She was to undergo surgery. And her son would show up at the homestead on one day prior to the surgery and say, "Mom, I need to take you somewhere. I need to show you something." Now, this is after a lifetime of denial, a lifetime of not acknowledging anything. In fact, the first time that we had approached Proctor, his response was, "I wasn't even born back then," which was quite a surprise to his mother, given she was the one who told us he was there. She would know. But he would drive her out towards that very ranch. And he thought, or she thought, that they were just going to go out to the debris field. And maybe he was going to admit something. "Yeah, I was with Mac when he found all that wreckage." But no, they continued on. And they drove on for another few miles till they arrived up at the top, not at the bottom, but at the top of the bluff. And he helped his mother out of the vehicle, out of the pickup truck. And Loretta was quick to tell us. But all her son Dee would say was, "Mother, this is where Mac found something else." And we know what that something else was. And the point being, we had also been to that location via other witnesses prior to Proctor finally confirming it to his own mother. Now, her surgery was successful. She lived on another 25 years. And she still couldn't get him to utter another word about it for as long as he lived, because he had passed on 10 years before she did. So you see that even the experience itself can place you in such a lockbox that you can't surface, you can't come out of your own imprisonment. Not only because you yourself can't deal with it, but you don't want to lay it on any of your loved ones. You don't want to share something that unearthly, that unbelievable, and have it affect them as it has destroyed you. And in the case of Timothy D. Proctor, whatever happened, it did destroy him. That's my partner, Tom Carey, up atop and pointing to the very site that Loretta would then drive out with us and show us exactly where her son had pointed atop that bluff and said, "This is where Mac had found something else." I had mentioned earlier about the rancher when he first came into Roswell that he went not to the military, but he went to the sheriff, Sheriff George Wilcox. And Wilcox was an office. He was a desk sheriff. His chief deputy at that time was a Deputy Tommy Thompson, who would go on to become chief of police in Roswell. And Thompson was the go-to go out, and he was the one making the arrests, and incarcerating as far as those that would be arrested, and Wilcox basically was the pencil pusher, that type of thing. But nonetheless, he still was the sheriff. And you saw the Roswell Daily Record picture from Wednesday, July 9th, and that's the shot of Sheriff Wilcox fielding a lot of the press calls that were coming in. Tell us about what happened at Roswell. Tell us what the rancher told you. Tell us what you handled, what you saw that the rancher brought into your office. Needless to say that it was important enough that the sheriff, as well as much as Colonel Blanchard, the base commander at Roswell, had dispatched two of his intelligence officers, his lead intelligence officers, Marcel and Cavett, Wilcox dispatched two of his deputies to go check out the incident. So again, everybody was taking it serious. Nobody was able to identify the wreckage. They were all behaving as though something was out there, something unusual, and nothing had been reported, and that being the point. For as many times that we have flown over the area in small planes and helicopters, one thing in the high desert is quite evident, that once you are airborne, you can see for 50 miles. And the point being that this was days after the rancher discovered the debris field. He discovered the wreckage. Nobody else was looking for anything, and if we weren't looking for anything, we weren't missing anything. And if it wasn't ours, then it was somebody else's. So this was news to everyone involved. The sheriff, the deputies that were dispatched, and then in turn when Wilcox would contact the base just down the road, 10 miles south in Roswell. Now this is a family picture. Wilcox sitting on the sofa to your right, and then the grandkids. Sheriff Wilcox would not run for re-election. He had two daughters, Phyllis McGuire, pictured to your left, and Elizabeth Toke. We're we're outside the original courthouse where Brazel's first meeting with their father took place back on Sunday, July 6th. Their residence was on the second floor. You see the overhang. That's the front entrance. And then their living quarters were just above, upstairs. The window on the far right side of the picture on the first level was their father's office. That was the sheriff's office. Now, as I painted that image for you, and at the time that the rancher brought in a couple boxes of wreckage, one of the boxes went back with the base commander, Colonel Blanchard, to the base. The other box, the sheriff kept. So we would ask his two daughters when they gave us a tour of the old courthouse and their former their residence, where did your father keep the box of wreckage, the material that the rancher had brought in? And there was a closet. It was kept on the floor of the closet within their father's office. Well, the daughters would describe how this was a couple days after the balloon explanation headline. And they were upstairs, and they hear a loud roar of approaching vehicles. It sounds like it's coming from all directions. Now, I want you to keep in mind that local law enforcement, whether the sheriff's office, his deputies, or the local police chief, or the police officers, they could go on to any military facility in this country and arrest anyone on that base. They have full authority. Doesn't matter if you're a 4-star general. If I have reason to go and arrest you, you are coming with me. unless martial law is declared. We know that distinction. Martial law is then when the military takes charge. There's no martial law declared at this time, none whatsoever. And the two daughters watch as they see MPs storm in through the front entrance, through the cafeteria, the kitchen area, and through another side door. And they watch from the stairway as their father, who is the sheriff, is grabbed, his arm twisted behind his back, and his face pushed into the wall, and told, "Where is the rest of the stuff? Where's the rest of the wreckage that rancher brought in?" And he would quickly, "It's in the closet, it's in the closet." This is after the balloon explanation. And just imagine you're one of the daughters and you're watching your father being manhandled over what you've just read the day before was nothing more than a weather balloon. Now, it didn't end there. There's Phyllis McGuire with her daughter Dan. And Dan talked about how the reaction of his grandfather. And I mentioned that he never ran for re-election. One of the things that Wilcox was also ordered to do was serve as the military proxy. That when it came to the civilian witnesses, that he was the one that went from door to door. And he would then issue the ultimate threat that they had to keep their mouths shut, that they had to cooperate, or they would be killed. And then when we would learn through the Wilcox family, through his widow, Inez, pictured here. Inez lived out the rest of her life with her daughter, or excuse me, her granddaughter. This is Elizabeth Tulk's daughter, Barbara. She's a PhD, living in Texas. And before her grandmother, Inez, passed away, they called her Big Mama. As far as not for her size, but just because she was the senior woman in the family. She was the matriarch at that time. And they would ask, tell us about what happened back in 47. What happened with Grandpa? And Inez would finally confess in the last year of her life to Barbara that they also threatened to kill the entire family. That beyond the sheriff himself, beyond myself, they also said they would kill the rest of you if we didn't keep our mouths shut. Now again, we've all had grandmothers. Just imagine any one of your grandmothers confessing such an admission to you over any ordeal, any situation. And then just laugh it off, and then, she's obviously starting to, lose it. She's obviously been overstressed over something, or do we take her serious? And realize that if I plug in all the other elements that were involved, I realize that maybe Grandma's telling me the truth. Maybe we all have targets painted on our backs. And believe me, the Wilcox family, the daughters, and the grandchildren all took it totally deadpan serious. I talked about high offices. I'm on the far right. This was a conference that was hosted in Washington. The tallest gentleman right next to me is Hans Adam II, the Royal Prince of Liechtenstein. And he made a number of trips to Roswell to New Mexico because he was that interested, that fascinated in the incident. And he met with the Proctor family. He gave them a prize stamp collection from his country. And he had even offered to fund one of our archaeological digs. So you see once again that even high officials from other countries look at this and go, I don't believe for a second that this was a weather balloon or anything just as conventional. And they're willing to step forward and put their own reputations at stake. This is the old Ford dealership back in Roswell in 1947. And a gentleman by the name of Arthur Farnsworth operated the dealership at that time. I'm going to jump for a moment, because now we have a shot. This is of the fire, some of the firemen. We'll go back to that. In the middle is a fireman by the name of Dan Dwyer. And his daughter is the late Frankie Rowe. Frankie just passed away this past August. So we had her at our festival in Roswell for the last time. And it was a tremendous loss in that Frankie, who was all of 12 years old when this happened back in 47, she just had it was post-tonsil surgery. So her father had her wait at the firehouse. Well, he was gone on some errand. And unbeknownst to her, they had word from the sheriff, because the same phone line that came into the sheriff's office at that time also went into the firehouse. So they had learned about the crash of this unknown object outside of town. So her father, Dan Dwyer, and another fireman by the name of Lee Reeves, they drove out in one of their own cars. And they arrived out at the crash site. And later, he would describe what he had seen. And not only did he see the remains of the craft and a couple of the bodies, but he saw a survivor. And when he was asked, what did it look like? He would use the term, child of the earth, which is a Japanese cricket, or a Jewish beetle, as it's described. And if you see where the insect's head is imposed over the silhouette of the body, you see the eyes, the shape of the head. It's almost like the typical, as they would say, the gray that we hear about today. But back in 1947, there was no such terminology. The fact that he would use something common through the people of New Mexico at that time and say, child of the earth. That's what the bodies looked like. That's what the heads resembled. So you see, I hope it's large enough for especially you in the back. Again, you see the eyes, the shape of the head. So it gives you a perspective. It gives you almost a reference point. I mentioned that, I'll add this as far as in a similar vein. The rancher's son, Mac Roswell's son, Bill Jr., had a piece of the memory material, and he took some of it over to one of the young rancher's daughters. Her name was Sally Tetralini. And he rode up on horseback, and she was working out in the yard, and he walked up to her, and he had this piece of metal-like material in his hands. And she watched how every time he would, clench his fist and, and crumble it up in his hands, and he would release his grip, and it would just flow between his fingers. It would just smooth right out, no matter how often he did this. And her immediate reaction was, my God, wouldn't it be wonderful if clothes would be made of such material and I'd never have to iron again? So it paints, again, a picture. her perspective, Dan Dwyer's perspective, on earthly terms, on their terms, on how best to react, describe something on an earthly plane, especially when you're dealing something that may not be. When Frankie Rowe first described to us having seen some of the memory material at the firehouse, when a state police officer by the name of Robert Scroggins, on his way home to Hobbs, New Mexico, just an hour east of Roswell, so he would drive through Roswell, and he wanted to show it to some of his buddies at the firehouse, and Frankie happened to be there when there was a piece about the size of a handkerchief, and she actually got to hold it. And for her to describe, the exact same characteristics as she's watching everybody twist it and crumble it, and no matter what they did, and she would use the term quicksilver, that it flowed like quicksilver. It just smoothed right out. Well, later that evening, when her father would return home, he would describe how he had been out at the site, and that he not only saw the remains of this craft of unknown origin, he saw at first what they thought were children, small bodies, and then seeing the size of the heads, realizing they weren't children. And then the survivor, as it came staggering, stumbling, as he described, off from the distance. And then within moments, again, the convergence of vehicles, jeeps and trucks as the military stormed the site, quickly took charge and grabbed them and took them aside and said, "You didn't see anything. You're not to say anything about this." So he quickly would describe this and say, "Now, be prepared. This is probably the last time you're going to hear about this." The next day, her father, Dan, would be serving his duty at the firehouse. And who should arrive at the Dwyer residence but this officer and a couple of non-commissioned officers. And he would instruct Frankie and her sister, Dottie, to go into the bedroom while the mother remained in the kitchen. Now, many years later, when we were doing a radio interview, and it happened to be a radio station from Boston, and Frankie was in a side room on another phone line, and I'm talking to the host of the program, and he tosses a question to Frankie, and all at once, there's dead silence. And then we hear live over the air, during the radio broadcast, Frankie sobbing, weeping out loud. And the host quickly broke for a commercial. He was, he was kind enough that, okay, we'll be back in a moment. We'll make sure that Frankie Rowe is all right. I ran into the other room, and there she was, and she goes, that voice, that's who came to our home back in 1947. That accent, the Brooklyn accent of the host. And this gentleman, First Lieutenant Arthur Philbin from Brooklyn, New York. When we sent her a series of pictures, a whole lineup, so to speak, and asked her, identify, single out the gentleman who threatened you back in 1947. We already knew who it was, based on other eyewitnesses, and she fingered Arthur Philbin, former state police officer, Brooklyn, New York. That voice. Frankie would always become emotional talking about this. She had a difficult time talking about it, no matter what your accent. Because what Philbin had told her mother, and they overheard it from the bedroom, because believe me, they were listening. And Frankie described how with the baton, and if you ever say another word about this incident, we will kill your children. Now you're watching your mother being threatened, but you're the target. So is there any wonder, like even the Wilcox family described to us, that you always knew when the sheriff or his wife were going to talk about this, because they would pull the shades or close the drapes, and they would go into a room and they'd start whispering between themselves. You knew what they were talking about. After Frankie would marry, and her late husband was named James, and they moved from Roswell to Portales, an hour northeast of Roswell. And they had a severe lightning storm, wiped out their power, their electricity, and their phone. And when the phone tech had completed his repairs on the outside phone box, he came to the door and he said, "Ms. Rowe, did you ever have anybody tamper with your phone before?" And he says, "This device was on your phone line. It's not from us. Did you do anything? Or as your husband, do you know that anybody ever, was messing around with your phone line? Because your line was tapped, Miss Rowe. Someone's been listening to you. And this is not a newer device." In fact, when Frankie turned it over to us, we traced it down to Motorola back in the 1950s. And it was a phone tap. So somebody was still listening. So you can see that Frankie would become even more paranoid, because it's like, I've moved from Roswell. I haven't even lived there in all these years, and they're still following me. I had mentioned the Ford dealership, and there you even see the Ford emblem in the upper left hand. Arthur Farnsworth. Farnsworth also owned the ranch to the north of Roswell, actually near where this had all happened. And on weekends, he would often, take the family, and they would actually go from the big city of Roswell, 50,000 people, but, go spend time and, seclusion up on the ranch. And it was right at the time that his daughter, Susan Farnsworth, remembered all the talk about the flying saucer crash north of town, and that how it just all was passed off and explained away as nothing more than a weather balloon. And she's described how she had two older sisters, but both of them suffered from childhood polio. So they didn't get about, they didn't work on the ranch. They had a difficult time, and she was the youngest, but she was healthy. So she always helped her dad. And on this particular day, he took her out on horseback, and he took her out to where he always would take her when he wanted total seclusion, total privacy. So she knew that he was going to tell her a secret. And according to Sue, her father paced around for some time, and he kept looking around as though he expected somebody to show up at any moment. But then, when he seemed to become a little bit more at ease, he finally sat down and he said, "Honey, the military was out here a few days ago. And they threatened your father. You heard about the flying saucer, didn't you? Well, I went out. As the word got out between the ranchers, I went to check it out myself. I saw what it was. They found out about me. And they warned me if I ever talk about it again, my entire family would be in jeopardy. So I want you to know that if your father ever behaves in a peculiar manner or in a way that he appears to be afraid, it's not because of anything he did or anything you did. I just happened to see something I shouldn't have. Please believe your dad. And it was never brought up again, but nonetheless, it was something that it left a lifetime impact on Sue. And when she confessed it, when she talked about it, and she became emotional and she cried because she relived it. It was as though her father was sitting right with her at that moment. I would suggest we were all around at 9/11. And I see that many of us were there on November 22nd of 1963. And often the skeptics will say, well, your witnesses, they're all elderly types with failing memories. They exaggerate, they embellish. They just don't remember the truth as I tell you it happened. But for all of us who remember November 1963, for the rest of our lives, we will remember exactly where we were and what we were doing when we got the first news. And we weren't there. These people were. And we should expect any less from them? That something of that magnitude would slowly start to fade away and they would forget what they were told or what they saw or what they actually held in their hands? True, certainly if it was a weather balloon, I'd forget the next day. But all you have to do is keep in mind that anything that we have experienced of a profound nature is indelibly etched in our memories forever. And no one, and as these witnesses have often said to us, no one will ever take that from us, no matter what the government tells you it was. This is a group picture of Mac Brazel. I talked about the original rancher. And sitting on the ground in front is his son, Vernon. And this is one of the more, here's Mac from the Albuquerque Journal. He made the front page after the balloon explanation because they wanted to also demonstrate that it was just a ranch foreman, just a cowboy. You know, he's not educated like someone who could make such a ill-fated misidentification of a weather balloon. Just look at him. No wonder he thought it was a flying saucer, because they even thought that way back then. This is the last picture of Brazel that we've ever seen before he died of a massive heart attack in 1963. Here he is with when he was a security guard. There he's in the middle. His son, Bill. Actually, it's Bill to your right and his son, Paul, to your left. Here's his son, Bill, just a few months before he passed away. He had a ranch in Capitan, New Mexico. Capitan is a little over an hour west of Roswell. How many remember Sam Donaldson from ABC News? Well, Donaldson owns the ranch just to the east of the Roswell Ranch. In fact, Donaldson had offered to buy the Roswell Ranch on one occasion. And when he made his offer, they pretty much told him where he could go. And he's become a better neighbor. In fact, I've talked with him since, and he is a native of New Mexico. He went to the New Mexican Military Institute in Roswell. And so he's gotten back to his roots and his appreciation, because for a while it was like wherever he was, don't you know who I am? Do you know who I am? That type of thing. And the people of New Mexico don't judge people by their credentials. They judge you by who you are. So, but nonetheless, months after the military occupation, after the cleanup, and there would be heavy rains at the very ranch, which at that time was a 75,000 acre ranch. 700 head of cattle, 700 head of sheep. Today it's an 85,000 acre ranch. 85,000 acres. And Brazel, Bill Jr., pictured here, would ride out, and he started to find some of the remnants of the crash. He found relics, he found pieces that would wash to the surface from the rain. And he found enough pieces that filled up a cigar box. One of the pieces he would keep in his leather chaps as he'd work the ranch through the day, and his wife Shirley would describe to us that he'd sit down to dinner in the evening, and she'd watch as he would take that piece out, and no matter what he did with his steak knife or with his lighter, and he would crumble it up and he would lay it out, and no matter what, it would just always smooth right out. And he was entertained by this night after night after night. And so one particular night, he was at the local pub, it was called Wade's Bar, in Corona, New Mexico, about an hour from the ranch house. They were playing pool. And one of his friends just brought this up and said, you know, Bill, did your father ever tell you what ever became of all that strange wreckage that came down here? What did he ever say about that? And did you ever find anything yourself? And Bill would respond, well, I found a few scraps. That's how he put it. I found a few scraps. And who should be at his house the very next morning but a Captain Emerson Armstrong, who we tracked down, we verified. Captain Emerson Armstrong and 3 non-commissioned officers. And Armstrong standing at the door, Mr. Brazel, we know what you have and you will give it to us. And he turned over the cigar box. Well, we sit there and we go, well, we wouldn't have done that. Well, again, put yourself back in their shoes. 2 years post-World War II, the military walked on water. The government, you know, whatever they proclaimed, whatever they acknowledged, whatever they announced was gospel. Patriotism was at all-time high post-World War II. So yes, he turned it over. And then while they led him out to the very site, because they wanted to see for themselves, now show us where you found these pieces. And as they were canvassing the original debris field, his daughter Fawn and his wife Shirley didn't hear a knock on the door, but a number of MPs walked right into the house. And they started to pull out drawers. And they started to go through the closet. And then they watched as they went outside and they slid open bags of feed, and then they tipped over a small water tank because they were looking for other pieces that Brazel didn't acknowledge, didn't admit. This happened 2 years after the incident. So in other words, in 1949, they were still watching. And again, I will keep asking, because it still stands as the official explanation, over a weather balloon. Here we are with Bill Brazel's late sister, Bessie Brazel Schreiber, and she would concede before she died that what her father had handled, what he described, what he had witnessed, was something that so terrified him, so upset him, so changed his life that he was never the same. This is a picture of her nephew, Vernon. I mentioned that Vernon is probably one of the most bizarre stories we've ever heard, because Vernon was also with Timothy D. Proctor and his father when he discovered a couple of the bodies. We never had a chance to talk to Vernon because Vernon, as he left high school, he went into the Navy. And when he returned from the service in 1960, he took on a job, bought a car, bought a small house, had a girlfriend, was settling down. And all at once, within a matter of months, he didn't show up for work. They found his car abandoned just south here on the border. Not in New Mexico, but in California here. He didn't pick up his final paycheck, and he didn't say a word to his girlfriend. The family would be told after an extensive investigation by the New Mexican State Police in Grants, New Mexico, that he had died while fishing without presenting a body or, again, any witnesses to that effect. So, as far as Mac and his parents, Mac and Margaret, and his own father, Bill Jr., and the rest of the Brazel family, Vernon disappeared in 1960 without a trace. Advance 42 years. And a woman shows up in Corona, New Mexico, wanting to meet with the surviving Brazel family. Her name was Tunnehill. She had been married to the late Edward Tunnehill, who just happened to have Vernon tattooed on his forearm, who he would always explain was his father. And after she discovered that his social security number was not that of an Edward Tunnehill, but was rather that of a Vernon Brazel. So she met with the Brazel family, and she explained that at that time, and she got to meet with Bill Jr., his father, that he didn't die right away. He would, according to the Tunnehill family, he committed suicide 7 years later, but that he arrived up in Helena, Montana with the name not Vernon Brazel, but Edward Tunnehill. Married, had 2 daughters, but as I said, his social security number was Vernon Brazel. Who had snatched him away from his entire family. And for what reason? That there was absolutely zero contact. Just imagine again, any one of us would be deprived any further contact with our mom, our dad, our brothers, our sisters, our nieces, nobody. And for what, again, reason? As I said, it's a very bizarre, very strange, but the point is, this happened. This is a matter now of public record. Even the police investigation from Grants, New Mexico, because we were the ones who determined that they wrapped up the disappearance of Vernon Brazel as a drowning. They didn't even tell the Brazel family that until after we exposed that. And the fact that Bill got to finally learn before he died that Vernon didn't disappear. For some reason, he was relocated in Helena, Montana, and then commit suicide 7 years later. His gravestone does read Vernon Brazel. And the family was not even aware of that until his widow finally came to Corona and tracked them down. It's a bizarre tale. But again, the one common denominator is that Vernon Brazel also witnessed the bodies. He didn't witness a weather balloon, I can assure you of that. Major Marcel, I talked about earlier, being dispatched and then being ordered to pose with the weather balloon. This is a shot of the debris field. The next one is the Hines house. This is where the night before, when Brazel would lead the two intelligence officers, Major Marcel and counterintelligence officer Captain Sheridan Cabot, they would spend the night here before they would actually go to the debris field. You see, again, I said it's high desert. It's wide open. If we were missing anything, they would have discovered it long before the rancher even did. And yet, the point being, nobody was looking for anything. We weren't missing anything. So whose was it? The weather balloon. If you look, you remember the term spit shine. That's a military term. Because, again, especially the officers, if you look closely at the shoes, they're all covered in dust. That's all from the debris field from the day before. Because everything moved so quickly. And as Brazel would stay out at the ranch house, and then he was picked up by the press. Marcel is dispatched to Fort Worth for the balloon press conference. His boss, Colonel William Blanchard, announces he's going on leave. Now think again, for you who are military or former military, why would you go on leave after a 4th of July weekend when you could take it over the 4th of July weekend and not be docked those days and be able to add them on as part of your whole leave time? Why would you first take leave after the holiday? Makes no sense. But in reality, what Colonel Blanchard did was he set up a base of operation out at the crash site. So he was actually in charge during the recovery operation. So the principal players involved. Marcel is at Fort Worth. Colonel Blanchard is on leave. And where is the rancher? He's been abducted by the military for the next 5 days. He's kept at the guest house, as they would call it. He is forced to take an Army physical, including a full body cavity search. He's kept up all hours of the night where they peppered him. They asked him the same questions over and over and over again. Now again, the military has absolutely no authority over we civilians. They did not even afford him due process. They didn't allow him to even call his own wife to tell her he was all right. Nobody knew where he was for the next 5 days. Again, a matter of historic fact. Now, does that look like you couldn't cut it or burn it? Or you would crumble it up and it would just smooth right out right before your eyes? And those wooden sticks are actually I-beams, and you see that black cluster to his left, that's the neoprene rubber. You know, it's been exposed out in the hot desert sun, so it's rotted, and it's even the very reporter from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, his name was J.B. Johnson, James Bond Johnson. And he talked about his interesting name, James Bond Johnson. And he talked about as he approached General Ramey's office that the hallway just reeked of the burnt rubber, the rotting rubber from the weather balloon. So, is there anyone here this evening that is having a hard time identifying that wreckage? Here we are in 2017, and they're still telling us this is what was recovered at Roswell, and none of these people could tell the difference. And they were in charge of the atomic bomb back at that time. It's a group picture. That's Marcel's son next to me, the gentleman in the shorts. Jesse, it's Doctor. He was a ear, nose, and throat surgeon, Dr. Colonel Jesse Marcel Jr. And then the rest of the people are some of the surviving Brazel family. The interesting thing about Jess Jr., who just died 4 years ago, this past August, he was the lone Marcel child at that time. And when his father was returning from the debris field, about 2 o'clock in the morning, on his way back to the base, his son is roused and their mother, Viad, are taken to the kitchen. And there's this wreckage all scattered on the kitchen floor and table. So Jess Jr. got to hold and examine the actual wreckage. Now, how many remember, or how many know that Roswell is now up to 4 official explanations? I always joke that husbands should try that with their wives if they come home too late some night. Interesting that we allow the government to get away with as many explanations until we finally pick one, we believe one. But we all know better, don't we? Why don't we trust what people tell us? Especially when they unanimously, because the first announcement, the first explanation was the actual flying saucer. The second was the Rowan weather balloon radar reflector kite. The third one, which most of you have heard about, is Project Mogul, the same type of weather balloon, but with a microphone, an acoustic listening device. And they would say, well, it was the microphone that confused the personnel at Roswell. They jumped to the conclusion it had to be alien. And the fourth explanation being the wooden crash dummies, the anthropomorphic wooden crash dummies. Project High Dive, which didn't even exist back in 1947. It finally was developed in 1952, 5 years later. And you know what the Pentagon's explanation for that in 1997 was? They created an entirely new medical malady called time compression. That as we get older, we not only start to confuse the years, but also the decades. So is it any wonder that many of the vets, the personnel from World War II in the 1940s, confused the decades and thought 1952 was actually 1947? And I can assure you there is no such medical condition. I'll never forget that at the end, and even the room full of reporters were snickering, they were laughing. And one of the reporters asked the Pentagon spokesperson, now what if the people don't believe this explanation? And the spokesperson, just very very coyly responded, well, then I guess we'll be back in another few years offering another explanation. We're stalling for time. We're running out the clock. Don't you get it? That's all it was. And so the principal officer, again, those of you with military backgrounds, the principal officer who wrote the Project Mogul report and then wrote the Wooden Crash Dummy report, which was Roswell Case Closed, that was the title of it, was a captain who then became Major James McAndrew. He was a captain at the time, and he was in the reserves. Now, why would the Pentagon select someone, a low-ranking officer, in the reserves to investigate anything? Because you're safe. You don't know anything. You can't slip. You can't make a mistake because the only answers you have are those which you have developed yourself. He would become the authority, the expert on Project Mogul. He knew nothing about the actual incident. And he would call up Colonel Marcel on 5 different occasions. And he would argue with him. Now we're talking in the mid-1990s. 50 years after the incident, and he is finally screaming at him, according to Colonel Marcel. What's it going to take to convince you that all you saw in that kitchen that night was nothing but masking tape that had shrank from the desert heat? And Colonel Marcel finally responded to him, listen, Sonny, I outrank you, so watch who you're talking to, and you and nobody is going to ever tell me what I saw when they weren't there, and I know exactly what I held in my hands. To which then Captain McAndrew responded, well then, Colonel, I guess we'll never know what you actually saw. So he conceded. Now, it didn't prevent him from nonetheless still standing behind his reports. But he conceded. I guess we'll never know what really happened out there. Again, the Rashomon effect. We'll never know what really happened because we have to trust someone who we can't trust. We have to believe somebody who we can't, because then we'd have to accept that that's what really happened. This is a great story, this one right here. There was a freight yard to the east side of the base. And there was he worked with the civil service at that time. His name was Charles Woods. So he worked for the government. He was in charge of the freight yard. And he had his papers as far as the freight cars, what was to be loaded into the cars before shipping out. And it's right across from the tarmac, from Building 84. It's a B-29 hangar, one of the Super Fortress bomber hangars at that time. It's called P3 back then. And all at once he sees an escort of jeeps and a couple of trucks come racing from the hangar across the tarmac through the east gate and pull up alongside an empty freight car. And he watches a number of armed guards with rifles get out, and they're standing there. And he's watching from a distance as they get out and they start to load up these wooden crates into the open rail car. Well, then, at one point, he watches a piece of metal, that looked like metal, drop to the ground. but nobody seemed to notice. And he's thinking, because obviously all the talk through the community at that time was the crash of the flying saucer. And he's thinking, my God, is it? And please, I hope they don't notice, I hope they don't notice. And they didn't. So they would finish up, they'd all get back in their vehicles, drive back in through the east gate, and he would walk over and he'd step it down under the ground, stomp it down with his foot. Came back after dark. Again, it's across from the tarmac, so there's no guard, there's no personnel on that side of the base, alongside the runways of the tarmac. And he got his bearings, and he starts to feel around, and after a little effort, there it was. There it was. And he starts to, oh, it's real flexible. Oh my. And it's alive, it's moving. And then how it would spring right back no matter what he did with it. Well, then he obviously took it home. Talk about the ultimate souvenir. And he just happened to be, there when it was misplaced. 5 years later, his son is celebrating his 6th birthday. His son's name was James. And he opens up his gift. And his father kind of smirks. It's a piece of that weather balloon that crashed out here in 1947. His son was getting involved with a little local magic demonstration at that time. He actually put on a magic act. And the boys had a local little clubhouse that some of the fathers got together and nailed together for them. And so it was their little secret hideout. But he put on this magic act. And his birthday present became the finale, became the climax. And the kids would watch how little James would, bring this piece out, and he would pull it out of his little magic hat. And they would watch how he would crumble it up, and he would fold it and crease it no matter what he did. And then he would toss it up in the air. And they would watch how it would just hang there and float and then unravel and then just float to the ground. Ta-da! Well, within a few nights, word got out. Because when he went to once again retrieve his star prop, his star act for his next routine, somebody had broken into their clubhouse and had stolen it. It disappeared. Well, are we surprised? I mean, I'd love to, as I was able to talk to James and him to finally say, and they didn't find it. And I need to learn who I can give it to. Well, we've had a lot of false alarms of that sort, but obviously, once again, the trail is very cold in that regard. But this will tie in, if anybody recognizes the late Tommy Brookshire, NFL Hall of Fame, Philadelphia Eagles, Broadcaster Hall of Fame, famous sports broadcaster. Resident, native of Roswell, New Mexico. He was enjoying summer vacation from high school at that time. And he would help with his dad's filling station. And he heard that one of the local welding shops by the name of Tyner had a piece of metal that was really strange, really bizarre. So he talked to a couple of his friends and, well, take me over there. I'd like to, see what this is all about, what this talk is all about, this piece of metal. And he would be there with his classmates and, well, show Tommy. Show Tommy what you showed us. And he reluctantly, finally, he went to a work drawer and he pulled out this piece of metal about the size of the palm of your hand. And he held it out and he went, watch this. And here's Brookshire. Again, Philadelphia Eagles Hall of Fame. Broadcasting Hall of Fame. Describing to us, just a year before he died, just a couple of years ago, that Tyner would grab this piece, crumble it, hold it out, and then he tossed it lightly up in the air, and it just hung there as it unraveled for a moment before it finally just settled to the ground. He never went public with this. He wasn't looking for that type of notoriety. It wasn't as though he actually had the piece in hand, but nonetheless, Brookshire, as a major celebrity, had no call, had no reason. But yet he confided to us that he too handled, he saw, he witnessed clearly what was not a piece of a weather balloon kite. So again, the caliber, the experience, the background of the witnesses involved. And you might remember his last name was Summerall, Pat Summerall, and you see him standing to your right, and that's Brookshire with him. So I'm talking about a national NFL broadcaster. That he went from a Philadelphia Eagle, as far as football player, then Football Hall of Fame, and then he became, as far as a national broadcaster. And he's talking to us about Roswell. There he is, number 40. And there he is just before he died. So we're going to go way back, because I'd like to end with Frankie Rowe, we talked about earlier. Frankie Rowe would receive a phone call. And this is just within the last 5 years. Now, I mentioned earlier, she just passed away this last August. She receives a phone call after her husband James had passed away up in Portales, an hour northeast of Roswell. She moved back onto a small ranch west of Roswell, west of town. She lived there by herself. She had a few horses, some dogs. She just, enjoyed, getting back to her roots. And she, for having gone public and, being with us, doing interviews and doing some of the television and documentaries and things, and it built her confidence that she could talk about this in public, and they weren't going to hurt her any longer. And she wasn't, becoming emotional. She wasn't crying about it any longer. She receives this phone call from this stranger, this unknown gentleman. Ms. Rowe, I'm passing through New Mexico on my way back to Arizona. I really would like to stop by and meet with you. Could I do that, please? I need to do this. And to Frankie's first surprise and then to her fear, she said, yes, by all means, stop on by, I'm here. And for the next half an hour, she is, oh my God, should I just get in my pickup truck and leave? Do I lock the doors and pretend nobody's home? Do I call somebody to come sit with me? What have I done? What have I set myself up for? So she sticks it out. She waits. The doorbell rings. And she very reluctantly approaches and says, no, I've been facing my fears all along, and I shouldn't just make every new friend somebody that I push back. I need to answer the door. Which she did. Another gentleman was standing, and he introduced himself in this way. He said, Ms. Rowe, you met my father back in 1947, and it wasn't under the most pleasant of circumstances. He died many years ago, but if he were alive, he'd want you to have these. He'd want me to apologize for him because he was sorry. He was ordered to do what he did, and he was a good soldier. He was following orders. And he brought his arm from behind him, and he held out a bouquet of flowers. The gentleman's name was Brian Philbin, the son of Arthur Philbin, the officer who had come to the Dwyer home and threatened them. So in other words, he was not only just apologizing for his father, he was apologizing for the entire United States government, who had threatened all those witnesses back then, who had robbed all of those witnesses of their faith, their belief that our government's sole preoccupation is our protection and our defense. That we go to bed at night believing that, we sleep under a flag of freedom and liberty. Again, 1947. But he wanted her to know that such faith could still be renewed, such a trust, such a renewal. And with Frankie, she described it as it was like, and she called me right up. She said, I wept tears of joy, and it was like everything had just been washed clean. We had asked Frankie a number of times if we could react that whole situation publicly. We wanted to do it at the next festival. And Brian Philbin was willing to do it. Present another bouquet of flowers as a peace offering, as a peace gesture on behalf of the United States government to all of the witnesses from 1947. We are sorry. Closure, but also admission that what you saw, what you held in your hands, it did happen. Because you don't apologize for threatening people over a weather balloon. You pay them off for the rest of their lives because you have one hell of a lawsuit. So clearly it's something demonstrating national security. Clearly it's something after all these years. I still, as some of you have heard me say in the past, I maintain it's a cover-up of ignorance. They still don't have any answers. They've never been able to reverse engineer it. They've never been able to find the on button. So part of their lack of disclosure is they have nothing to disclose. So here we are now, 70 years later. And our museum in Roswell continues to grow. Last year, we're coming off of our most highly attended year to date. In 25 years, we had almost 250,000 people last year. Roswell's a destination city. It's on the way to nowhere. You have to go out of your way to get, and as you know, go out of your way to get there. So I invite all of you. But I'm going to end on this note. General Roger Ramey, one of the main arbiters of the weather balloon explanation, he's the one that ordered Major Marcel to pose with the weather balloon. He's long deceased. He passed away in 1965, thereabouts. You know, his family, his surviving family, has been to our museum in Roswell on 2 separate occasions. And their father, her late husband, are not presented too kindly at the museum. In fact, quite accurately. And yet, the son said to us, or said to the staff at the museum as they were leaving, "We just wanted to make sure you got it right." And you did. And from another child of Roswell, the children of those who were also part of the cover-up, the maintenance of that cover-up, the children who were those making the threats, the fact that they're now making sure we got it right, and they're also offering us peace flowers. I am all the more compelled, given that 99.9% of the actual 600-some witnesses we've interviewed in the past nearly 30 years. We have over 600 witnesses either directly or indirectly involved to that first press release. There are absolutely 0 to the weather balloon, there are 0 to the Project Mogul, and there are 0 to the wooden crash dummies. So who would win in a court of law? Who would win in the court of public opinion? And now our compulsion, our devotion, our continuing commitment is to finish what we started. And now for the passed on witnesses, but also for their families. Because if we don't take their cause and fight for the truth, then who will? I appreciate your being here tonight because you also demand the truth. You feel we not only deserve it, but we more than have earned it. And at one time, we were the government. At one time, we were in charge. And ladies and gentlemen, it is time we once again take it back. Thank you.